Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in rural Tennessee. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1901 in Cumberland County, Tennessee, was brutally cold. Snow had been falling intermittently since early December, blanketing the rolling hills and deep hollows of the Cumberland Plateau in an unforgiving white shroud. The isolated farmsteads scattered throughout the region were cut off from one another by miles of treacherous mountain roads that became nearly impassable once the weather turned. It was in this harsh landscape that the events surrounding Lydia Crane's disappearance would unfold, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the mountain communities for decades to come. Lydia Crane was 28 years old when she vanished without a trace from her husband's property on the night of January 15th, 1901. She had been married to Cornelius Crane for nearly 6 years, a union that local records suggest was arranged more for practical purposes than affection. Cornelius owned a substantial tract of land in the remote Sequatchie Valley, where he operated a modest timber operation and maintained a small herd of cattle. The Crane homestead sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that wound through dense stands of oak and hickory, accessible only by horseback or on foot during the winter months. According to the sparse documentation that survives from that period, Lydia had come from a family of modest means in nearby Crossville. Her father, Jedediah Whitmore, had been a blacksmith who struggled to make ends meet after a mining accident left him partially disabled. The marriage to Cornelius represented security for both Lydia and her family, though those who knew her described her as a woman who seemed perpetually melancholy, as if carrying an invisible burden. The Crane property consisted of the main house, a 2-story log structure with a stone chimney that Cornelius had built himself, along with a barn, a smokehouse, and several smaller outbuildings. The nearest neighbors, the Pendleton family, lived approximately 3 miles away through dense forest, connected only by a barely maintained trail that became treacherous in winter. This isolation would prove crucial to the mystery that would soon unfold. In the months leading up to Lydia's disappearance, several neighbors had begun to notice changes in the routine of the Crane household. Martha Pendleton, wife of their nearest neighbor, would later tell investigators that she had grown concerned about the lack of smoke from the Crane chimney during daylight hours. In mountain communities, where warmth was essential for survival, a cold hearth during winter days was highly unusual and suggested that something might be wrong. More troubling were the sounds that began emanating from the Crane property during the long winter nights. Jeremiah Pendleton, during his occasional hunting expeditions, reported hearing what he described as unnatural conversations coming from the direction of the Crane house. These voices, which seemed to carry clearly through the cold night air, appeared to be coming from multiple people, though the Pendletons knew that only Lydia and Cornelius lived on the property. The conversations, according to Pendleton's account, had a rhythmic, almost ritualistic quality that was unlike normal household discussions. Sometimes the voices would continue for hours, rising and falling in intensity, punctuated by long periods of complete silence. On several occasions, Pendleton considered investigating these sounds more closely, but the distance and difficult terrain, combined with a reluctance to intrude on his neighbor's privacy, prevented him from doing so. Even more disturbing were reports from travelers who occasionally passed near the Crane property on their way to more distant settlements. A traveling merchant named Ezra Kingsley, who regularly traversed the mountain roads, selling goods to isolated families, reported to local authorities that he had observed strange lights moving through the woods around the Crane house during night hours. These lights, which appeared to be lanterns carried by multiple individuals, followed no logical pattern and seemed to move through areas of the forest where no paths existed. Kingsley's account was particularly troubling because he had been making these journeys for more than a decade and was intimately familiar with the normal patterns of activity in the region. The lights he observed were unlike anything associated with typical farming, hunting, or timber work, and their erratic movement suggested activities that he could not readily explain or understand. On the surface, the cranes appeared to live a typical rural existence, though several community members would later recall subtle signs that all was not well in their household. Cornelius was known among the scattered community as a hard worker, but he had gradually become increasingly withdrawn and suspicious of outsiders. A traveling minister, Reverend Matthias Blackwood, who occasionally held services in the area, noted in his journal that Cornelius had grown peculiar in his habits since his marriage. The Reverend's observations, recorded in entries dating back to the summer of 1900, described a man who seemed to be under constant stress and who displayed an unusual preoccupation with privacy and secrecy. During the minister's visits to the area, Cornelius would often appear unexpectedly at the locations where services were being held, but would remain at a distance, watching the proceedings without participating or engaging in conversation with other attendees. More puzzling was Cornelius's behavior when directly approached by the Reverend or other community members. He would often respond to simple questions with answers that seemed evasive or unrelated to what had been asked. When questioned about his wife's health or well-being, he would become visibly agitated and would quickly change the subject or make excuses to leave the conversation. Lydia, meanwhile, had become increasingly absent from community gatherings. While this wasn't entirely unusual for women in isolated rural areas, even by the standards of the time, her complete withdrawal from social contact was notable. The few documented interactions with neighbors suggest she had grown increasingly fragile and withdrawn in the months leading up to her disappearance. Martha Pendleton recorded in her diary that during a chance encounter at the local trading post in December of 1900, Lydia appeared unnaturally pale and spoke in such a quiet voice that she had to strain to hear her words. More concerning was Lydia's apparent confusion about basic details of her daily life. When asked about routine matters such as her household activities or the weather, she would often pause for long periods before responding, as if struggling to remember or understand the questions. The trading post, operated by Zebulon McCready, served as the unofficial center of community life for the scattered families of the region. McCready's establishment was located at the intersection of two mountain roads, making it accessible to residents from several different valleys and hollows. It was here that news, gossip, and essential supplies were exchanged among neighbors who might otherwise go months without seeing one another. According to McCready's account, given to investigators several weeks after the disappearance, Cornelius had begun visiting the trading post with unusual frequency during the autumn of 1900. Previously, he had been an infrequent customer, typically making only essential purchases and conducting his business quickly and quietly. However, starting in October, he began appearing regularly, sometimes multiple times per week, to purchase items that struck McCready as unusual for someone in his circumstances. Most of these purchases involved basic supplies, but McCready noted that Cornelius had begun buying them in unusually large quantities. He would request multiple lanterns, excessive amounts of rope and canvas, and large quantities of preserved foods that seemed far beyond what a household of two people would normally require. When questioned about these bulk purchases, Cornelius would provide vague explanations about preparing for harsh weather or expanding his timber operations. More puzzling were Cornelius's requests for certain books and publications dealing with topics that seemed unrelated to farming or timber work. Rural trading posts of the era rarely carried such specialized materials, but McCready was able to order several publications for Cornelius through his suppliers in Nashville. These included texts on astronomy, geology, and what appeared to be philosophical works dealing with isolation and solitude. Macready also noted that Cornelius's demeanor had changed markedly during these visits. Previously, he had been quiet but pleasant, occasionally engaging in small talk about weather and local affairs. During the autumn visits, however, he became increasingly agitated and suspicious, frequently looking over his shoulder and asking whether anyone else had been inquiring about his purchases or activities. These behavioral changes became more pronounced as winter approached. Macready's final recorded interaction with Cornelius occurred on January 3, 1901, just 12 days before Lydia's disappearance. On that occasion, Cornelius appeared extremely disturbed and demanded to know whether anyone had been asking questions about him or his wife. When Macready assured him that no such inquiries had been made, Cornelius became even more suspicious, suggesting that Macready might be concealing information from him. The conversation took an even stranger turn when Cornelius began discussing what he called the true nature of solitude and its effects on the human mind. Macready, a practical man with little formal education, found these comments confusing and somewhat alarming. Cornelius spoke about the need to understand what happens to people when they are truly alone, and claimed that most people had no real comprehension of the psychological effects of complete isolation. The events of January 15, 1901, remain shrouded in mystery and contradictory accounts. According to Cornelius's own testimony to local authorities, he had spent the day cutting timber on a distant section of his property. The work was difficult in the snow, and he returned to the house well after dark, exhausted and looking forward to the warmth of his fireplace. He claimed that when he entered the house, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The details of what Cornelius found that evening would become the source of considerable speculation and debate. In his initial statement to Marshal Ezekiel Thornton, who served as the primary law enforcement officer for the remote region, Cornelius described the scene as disturbed but peaceful. Lydia's personal belongings remained in their usual places. Her winter coat still hung on its peg by the door, and the evening meal appeared to have been prepared, but left untouched on the kitchen table. What struck Cornelius as most unusual was the profound silence that filled the house. He reported that the normal sounds of settling wood, wind in the chimney, and other typical household noises seemed muffled or absent entirely. The fire in the main hearth had died down to cold ashes, suggesting it had not been tended for several hours. Most puzzling of all was the discovery that all the interior doors of the house stood wide open, though Lydia typically kept them closed to conserve heat during the winter months. Marshal Ezekiel Thornton was a man well suited to the challenges of law enforcement in the remote mountain communities of Tennessee. Born and raised in the region, he possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain, the families who lived there, and the various challenges that could arise in such an isolated environment. His appointment as marshal had come through a combination of his reputation for fairness and his ability to navigate the complex web of family relationships that characterized many mountain communities. Thornton arrived at the Crane property on January 17th after Cornelius had made the difficult journey through the snow to report his wife's disappearance. The marshal's initial examination of the property revealed few concrete clues. The snow around the house showed no footprints other than those made by Cornelius himself, both when he returned from work and when he left to seek help. The absence of any tracks leading away from the house was particularly puzzling, as it suggested that Lydia had not left the property on foot. Inside the house, Thornton noted several details that struck him as significant. While Lydia's personal effects were undisturbed, the arrangement of furniture and household items seemed somehow different from what would be expected in a normal home. Chairs had been moved from their usual positions, and several pieces of furniture appeared to have been repositioned to create clear sight lines between rooms. This arrangement gave the interior a strangely open, almost ceremonial appearance. More intriguingly, he discovered what seemed to be the beginnings of a letter in Lydia's handwriting, found on the writing desk in the main room. The partial letter, addressed to her sister in Crossville, contained only a few lines. "My dearest Clarissa, I fear I must tell someone of the strange occurrences that have been troubling our household. Each night I hear sounds that seem to come from within the very walls themselves, and I sometimes feel as though I am being watched by eyes I cannot see." Cornelius has grown distant and speaks often to himself, but when I ask what troubles him, he only says that we are being prepared for something. The letter ended abruptly, with what appeared to be a large ink blot, where she had apparently stopped writing suddenly. Thornton noted that the ink was still slightly damp when he discovered it, suggesting it had been written recently. A search of the house revealed no additional correspondence or diary that might have provided further insight into Lydia's state of mind or the events she had described. However, Thornton's investigation did uncover other details that seemed significant. Throughout the house, he found evidence of unusual activities that had no clear explanation. Several rooms showed signs that furniture had been repeatedly moved and rearranged, creating patterns that served no obvious functional purpose. In the main living area, chairs had been arranged in a perfect circle around a cleared space in the center of the room, as if for some kind of gathering or ceremony. More puzzling were markings found on the walls and floors of several rooms. These appeared to be symbols or characters scratched into the wood, though their meaning was unclear. Some resembled letters or numbers, while others looked more like abstract designs. When questioned about these markings, Cornelius claimed they were simply scratches made by furniture being moved or by normal household activities, though their systematic arrangement suggested a more deliberate purpose. The investigation expanded to include interviews with the few neighbors and acquaintances who had known the couple. These conversations revealed a picture of growing strangeness within the Crane household that had not been immediately apparent to the outside world. Several people mentioned that in recent months, both Cornelius and Lydia had seemed increasingly anxious and withdrawn from normal social contact. Jeremiah Pendleton told Marshall Thornton about his observations of unusual nighttime activities at the Crane property. In addition to the strange voices he had mentioned earlier, he reported seeing lights moving through the woods around the house in patterns that seemed purposeful but incomprehensible. These lights would sometimes disappear for hours at a time, only to reappear in completely different locations, as if their bearers were following some complex route through the forest. Pendleton also mentioned that he had occasionally detected unusual odors coming from the direction of the Crane property, particularly during calm nights when scents could carry long distances through the cold air. These smells, which he described as like burning herbs, but stronger and more bitter, were unlike anything associated with normal cooking, heating, or farming activities. The odors would sometimes persist for hours, suggesting that whatever was producing them involved sustained activity rather than brief, isolated incidents. Martha Pendleton provided additional details about her interactions with Lydia during the months preceding the disappearance. According to Martha, Lydia had seemed increasingly disoriented and confused during their brief encounters. She often appeared to have difficulty recognizing familiar people or remembering recent conversations. Her responses to simple questions were sometimes delayed or inappropriate, as if she was struggling to understand what was being asked of her. More concerning were several comments Lydia had made about feeling that she was losing track of time and experiencing periods where she could not remember what had happened to her. She complained of waking up in strange locations within her own house with no memory of how she had gotten there. Sometimes she would find herself standing in rooms she had no reason to visit, or discover that hours had passed without her awareness of what she had been doing during that time. Martha also mentioned that Lydia had expressed fears about the nighttime activities she could hear but not see. She described lying awake for hours, listening to sounds that seemed to come from all around the house. But when she tried to investigate their source, she would find nothing out of the ordinary. These experiences had left her feeling that she could no longer trust her own perceptions or rely on her ability to understand what was happening in her own home. Other neighbors provided similar accounts of interactions with the Crane couple that, in hindsight, suggested something was seriously wrong. Ezra Kingsley, the traveling merchant who had observed the strange lights, reported that Cornelius had become obsessed with discussing theories about isolation and its effects on human behavior. These conversations had initially seemed like the harmless philosophizing of an educated man living in a remote area, but had gradually become more intense and disturbing. According to Kingsley, Cornelius had begun expressing beliefs that prolonged isolation could fundamentally change a person's relationship with reality. He spoke about the possibility that people living in complete solitude might develop abilities or perceptions that were not available to those living in normal social environments. These ideas, while not necessarily harmful in themselves, were discussed by Cornelius with an intensity and conviction that made Kingsley uncomfortable. Kingsley also reported that Cornelius had made several inquiries about the availability of materials that seemed unrelated to his normal activities. He had asked about purchasing large quantities of candles, mirrors, and various herbs and plants that grew wild in the region. When questioned about his need for these items, Cornelius provided vague explanations that seemed to change depending on who was asking and when the conversation took place. As the investigation continued, a picture emerged of a household that had gradually become isolated not just physically, but psychologically, from the normal patterns of community life. The combination of Cornelius's increasingly erratic behavior and Lydia's apparent disorientation suggested that something had been systematically undermining their connection to reality and to each other. Clarissa Whitmore, Lydia's sister, provided perhaps the most disturbing testimony when she finally arrived from Crossville in early February. She revealed that Lydia had sent her a series of letters over the past several months that painted a picture of increasing fear and confusion. According to Clarissa, Lydia had complained that their daily routines had become strange and unpredictable, with Cornelius insisting on changes that seemed to serve no practical purpose. Lydia had written that Cornelius had begun requiring that they spend long periods each evening sitting in complete darkness and silence. He claimed this was necessary for developing their awareness of subtle sounds and movements, but Lydia found these sessions deeply unsettling. During these periods of enforced silence, she would hear sounds that seemed to come from within the walls of the house itself, as if something was moving through hidden passages or spaces. More disturbing were Lydia's descriptions of her husband's behavior during these evening sessions. She wrote that Cornelius would often appear to be responding to sounds or voices that she could not detect, turning his head to follow sounds that remained inaudible to her. Sometimes he would whisper responses to what seemed to be unheard questions, carrying on conversations with invisible participants while she sat in confused silence. Clarissa also revealed that in her last letter, received just 3 days before her disappearance, Lydia had mentioned that she was no longer certain about the layout of their own house. She described finding doors that she did not remember seeing before and discovering that familiar rooms seemed to have changed in subtle ways that she could not clearly identify. Most disturbing was her claim that she sometimes found evidence of activities that had occurred in her home, but that she had no memory of witnessing or participating in. The letters from Lydia also described a series of incidents that suggested reality itself was becoming unreliable for her. She wrote about losing track of entire days, finding objects in locations where she was certain she had not placed them, and waking up to discover that furniture had been rearranged overnight. When she questioned Cornelius about these changes, he would either claim not to notice them or provide explanations that seemed to change each time she asked. Most alarming were Lydia's descriptions of feeling that she was being observed by unseen watchers. She wrote about sensing eyes upon her, even when she was alone, and feeling that her every movement was being scrutinized by something that remained hidden. These sensations were strongest during the nighttime hours, when the darkness seemed to contain presences that became more active and attentive as the evening progressed. During his examination of the Crane property, Marshal Thornton discovered evidence that supported some of Lydia's claims about the strange changes occurring in their household. In several rooms, he found indications that the normal arrangement of furniture and belongings had been repeatedly altered. Scratches and scuff marks on the floor suggested that heavy items had been moved frequently, creating different configurations that served no apparent practical purpose. More puzzling was the discovery of what appeared to be hidden spaces within the structure of the house itself. Behind one of the main rooms, Thornton found a narrow gap between the interior and exterior walls that had been enlarged to create a space large enough for a person to move through. This hidden passage connected several rooms and could allow someone to move through the house without using the normal doorways and hallways. The existence of this concealed route through the house raised disturbing questions about the nature of the activities that had been taking place there. It suggested that someone had been deliberately moving through the dwelling in secret, possibly observing the occupants without their knowledge. The careful construction of the passage indicated that considerable time and effort had been invested in creating this hidden means of access. Thornton also discovered that several of the interior walls had been modified to include small openings that were nearly invisible from the interior of the rooms, but that would allow observation from the hidden passages. These spy holes had been carefully positioned to provide views of the main living areas where Lydia would have spent most of her time. The systematic nature of these modifications suggested that they were part of a deliberate plan to monitor and observe the household's activities. When confronted with the discovery of the hidden passages and observation points, Cornelius's explanations became increasingly vague and contradictory. He initially claimed that these modifications had been made by previous owners of the property and that he had never noticed their existence. However, when shown evidence that the work was recent, he changed his story to claim that he had been experimenting with different approaches to home construction and insulation. The investigation took another disturbing turn when searchers discovered evidence of activities in the forest surrounding the Crane property. Approximately half a mile from the main house, they found a clearing that showed signs of regular use over an extended period. The area had been carefully prepared with fallen logs arranged to form seating around a central fire pit. However, the arrangement was unlike anything associated with normal camping or hunting activities. The clearing showed evidence of repeated gatherings, but the nature of these meetings was unclear. Large quantities of candle wax had been melted and scattered throughout the area, creating patterns on the ground that seemed deliberate, but whose purpose was not apparent. Mixed with the wax were the remains of various plants and herbs, many of which were not native to the immediate area and would have had to be gathered from distant locations. More disturbing was the discovery of several items that appeared to belong to Lydia. Hidden beneath a pile of stones at one edge of the clearing were pieces of women's clothing, including a dress that Clarissa Whitmore identified as belonging to her sister. The clothing was stained and damaged in ways that suggested it had been exposed to the elements for an extended period, though the exact nature of the stains could not be determined. Also found in the clearing were several notebooks containing writings in different handwriting styles. Some entries appeared to be in Cornelius's writing and consisted of observations about natural phenomena, weather patterns, and the behavior of local wildlife. However, other entries were written in what might have been Lydia's hand, though the writing was so erratic and difficult to read that positive identification was impossible. These secondary writings described experiences that seemed to exist at the boundaries between reality and imagination. They mentioned encounters with figures that might have been real people or might have been hallucinations, and described events that could have been actual experiences or could have been dreams or visions. The confusion between different levels of reality was so complete that it was impossible to determine what, if anything, described actual events. One entry that could be deciphered with some confidence described what appeared to be a gathering in the forest clearing. The lights moved in patterns that seemed to have meaning, though I could not understand what they were trying to convey. The voices spoke words in languages that I did not recognize, but somehow I felt that I should be able to understand them. When I tried to respond, I found that my own voice had become strange to me, as if it belonged to someone else. Another partially legible entry described sensations of movement and travel. We walked for hours through paths that I had never seen before, though they seemed familiar somehow. The landscape around us shifted and changed as we moved, as if we were not traveling through normal space, but through some other kind of territory altogether. When we finally stopped, I could not remember where we had started or how we had gotten to our destination. When confronted with the discovery of the forest clearing and the evidence found there, Cornelius's behavior became increasingly erratic and offensive. He initially denied any knowledge of the location or the items found there, claiming that he rarely ventured far from his immediate property during the winter months. However, when shown his own handwriting in the notebooks, he was forced to acknowledge that he had at least some connection to the site. His explanation for the notebooks was that he had been conducting what he termed naturalistic observations of the local environment and wildlife. He claimed that the clearing had been established as a location where he could observe animal behavior without the distractions and influences of his normal domestic environment. The various items found at the site were supposedly related to these scientific activities, though he could not provide clear explanations for their specific purposes. However, these explanations failed to account for the presence of Lydia's clothing or for the disturbing content of the notebook entries that appeared to be written in her hand. When pressed for clarification about these elements, Cornelius became visibly agitated and began making contradictory statements about the nature and purpose of his activities in the forest. As February progressed with no sign of Lydia, the investigation began to focus more intensely on the mysterious activities that had apparently been taking place both at the Crane House and in the surrounding forest. The evidence suggested a pattern of behavior that was both systematic and deeply disturbing, though its exact nature and purpose remained unclear. Dr. Amos Kentfield, a traveling physician who had occasionally treated families in the remote area, was asked to examine the evidence and provide his assessment of what might have been occurring. Dr. Kentfield had received his medical training in Nashville and had chosen to practice in rural areas where his services were most needed. His experience with frontier medicine and his knowledge of the psychological stresses faced by isolated families made him particularly qualified to analyze the case. Dr. Kentfield's report described the evidence as being consistent with what he termed extreme psychological isolation and possible shared delusional experiences. He noted that prolonged isolation could sometimes lead to severe distortions in thinking and perception, particularly when combined with the stresses of frontier life and the absence of normal social contact and support. The physician suggested that Cornelius might have been experiencing what would today be recognized as a form of psychotic episode characterized by systematic false beliefs and altered perceptions of reality. The isolation of their living situation would have allowed these distorted thoughts to develop and intensify without the corrective influence of normal social interaction or professional intervention. More concerning was Dr. Kentfield's assessment that Lydia appeared to have been drawn into her husband's delusional system. possibly through a combination of psychological pressure and her own vulnerability to the effects of isolation. The evidence suggested that she had gradually lost the ability to distinguish between reality and the distorted perceptions that were being imposed upon her by her environment and circumstances. The physician also noted that the systematic nature of the activities described in the notebooks and evidenced by the physical modifications to the house suggested that whatever had been occurring was not simply random or impulsive behavior. Instead, it appeared to represent the implementation of some kind of organized plan or system, though the goals and purposes of this system remained unclear. Despite extensive searches of the area around both the house and the forest clearing, no trace of Lydia herself was ever found. The harsh winter conditions and the region's rugged terrain provided numerous locations where someone could disappear permanently, whether through accident, misadventure, or deliberate concealment. Before any formal charges could be brought against Cornelius, however, events took another unexpected turn. On March 20th, 1901, nearly 2 months after Lydia's disappearance, Cornelius Crane himself vanished from his property. Unlike his wife's mysterious disappearance, Cornelius's departure appeared to have been planned and deliberate. He had removed most of his personal belongings and left behind a note indicating his intention to seek solitude elsewhere. The note, addressed to Marshall Thornton, was brief, but provided some insight into his state of mind. "The isolation we sought has been achieved, though not in the way we originally intended. Lydia has found the complete solitude she needed to understand her true nature, and I must now find my own path to the same understanding. Do not waste resources searching for either of us, as we have moved beyond the reach of normal human contact." This cryptic message provided some sense of closure to the mystery of Lydia's fate, while raising new questions about the nature of the activities that had led to her disappearance. The reference to "the isolation we sought" suggested that both Lydia and Cornelius had been participating willingly in whatever had been occurring, though the evidence of her fear and confusion suggested that her participation had not been entirely voluntary. A final search of the Crane property after Cornelius's departure revealed additional evidence that supported the theory of systematic psychological manipulation and control. Hidden in various locations throughout the house, searchers found journals and notebooks that documented a gradual process of deliberate isolation and reality distortion that had been implemented over many months. The writings revealed that Cornelius had become obsessed with what he termed the study of pure solitude and its effects on human consciousness. Idiot, he had apparently believed that complete isolation from normal social contact could lead to enhanced awareness and understanding of reality, and had been using both himself and his wife as subjects in this investigation. The journals described a systematic process of severing connections with the outside world, eliminating normal patterns of social interaction, and creating an environment where the only reality was what existed within the confines of their isolated household. This process had apparently included the creation of alternative routines, modified living spaces, and engineered experiences designed to break down normal perceptions and replace them with new ways of understanding the world. Most chilling were the later entries, which suggested that the experiment had achieved its intended goals, at least from Cornelius's perspective. He wrote about both himself and Lydia reaching states of consciousness that transcended normal human experience, and achieving levels of isolation and solitude that few people had ever experienced. The final entries suggested that this achievement had come at the cost of their ability to exist within normal reality. Dr. Kentfield's analysis of these journals provided insight into the psychological processes that had led to the tragedy. He noted that Cornelius appeared to have been suffering from what would today be recognized as a severe delusional disorder, characterized by systematic false beliefs that he had maintained despite clear evidence of their harmful consequences. The isolation of their living situation had allowed these delusions to develop and intensify without any external reality check. The physician also observed that Cornelius's intellectual background and access to philosophical and scientific literature had provided him with a vocabulary and conceptual framework for rationalizing behavior that would otherwise have been recognized as obviously harmful. His ability to present his actions as part of a legitimate scientific or philosophical investigation had allowed him to maintain his self-image as a rational person while pursuing increasingly destructive goals. Cornelius Crane was never seen again after his departure from the property in March of 1901. Occasional reports surfaced over the following years of a man matching his description being spotted in various remote locations throughout Tennessee and neighboring states, but none of these sightings were ever confirmed. The harsh wilderness of the region provided numerous opportunities for someone seeking complete isolation to disappear permanently. The Crane property remained abandoned for several years after the disappearance of its owners. Local residents avoided the area, partly due to superstition and partly because of the disturbing associations with the case. The buildings gradually fell into disrepair, with windows broken by storms and vegetation beginning to reclaim the cleared areas around the homestead. In 1905, the land was purchased by a timber company that demolished the existing structures and harvested the valuable hardwood trees that covered much of the acreage. During the demolition process, workers reported several disturbing discoveries that added final details to the mystery. Hidden spaces within the walls of the house revealed additional evidence of the systematic modifications that had been made to the structure. Most significant was the discovery of a series of rooms or chambers that had been concealed within the house's design. These hidden spaces were accessible only through the secret passages that Marshall Thornton had discovered, and they appeared to have been used for purposes that remained unclear. The chambers contained various items including candles, mirrors arranged in complex patterns, and notebooks filled with writings in multiple handwriting styles. The notebooks found in these hidden chambers provided the most complete record of the activities that had taken place during the months leading up to the disappearances. They documented a systematic process of psychological experimentation that had gradually escalated from simple isolation to complete separation from normal reality. The final entries suggested that both participants had achieved what they considered to be a successful transcendence of normal human limitations. However, the exact nature of this transcendence remained unclear. The writings became increasingly abstract and disconnected from observable reality as they progressed, making it difficult to determine what actual events they were describing. The final entries were so far removed from normal language and logic that they provided no clear insight into what had ultimately become of either Lydia or Cornelius. The legacy of the Crane case extended far beyond the immediate mystery of the disappearances. The revelation that such systematic psychological manipulation could occur in an isolated, rural community prompted changes in how local authorities approached cases involving domestic relationships and mental illness. The case also highlighted the potential dangers of complete social isolation and the need for maintaining connections with the broader community. For the surviving members of Lydia's family, the case represented both closure and ongoing pain. Clarissa Whitmore spent years searching for any trace of her sister or information about her final fate. She eventually relocated to a different state, unable to bear the constant reminders of the tragedy that had befallen her family. In a letter written to Marshall Thornton in 1906, she expressed both gratitude for his investigation and frustration that complete answers had never been achieved. The broader community struggled to understand how such events could have occurred in their midst without detection or intervention. The case highlighted the vulnerability of isolated individuals and the potential for psychological abuse to continue unchecked when victims were cut off from family and social support systems. Several families in the region began making more deliberate efforts to maintain contact with isolated neighbors, particularly during the harsh winter months when communication was most difficult. Dr. Kentfield continued to study the psychological aspects of the case for several years, using his findings to educate other physicians about the recognition and treatment of severe isolation-related mental disorders. His work contributed to a better understanding of the effects of extreme solitude on human psychology and helped establish protocols for identifying cases where isolation had become pathological. The case also had lasting effects on Marshall Thornton, who later described it as the most challenging and disturbing investigation of his career. In his official report, he noted that the combination of systematic psychological manipulation and complete social isolation represented challenges that went beyond the typical scope of rural law enforcement. He recommended that future similar cases be referred to medical and psychological experts at the earliest stages of investigation. The physical evidence from the Crane case was eventually transferred to the state capitol for storage, though much of it was lost or destroyed in a fire that consumed part of the records building in 1923. The few surviving documents were eventually donated to the Tennessee State Archives, where they remain available for historical research. The case file has been studied by criminologists and historians interested in early American crime patterns and the effects of social isolation on human behavior. In recent decades, the Crane case has occasionally resurfaced in discussions of historical domestic abuse and the challenges faced by law enforcement in rural communities during the early 20th century. Some researchers have suggested that the systematic approach to psychological manipulation evidenced in the case represented an early example of what would later be understood as organized psychological abuse, though the unusual circumstances and isolated setting make direct comparisons with modern cases problematic. The remote location where the events occurred has been largely reclaimed by nature. The sites of both the original homestead and the forest clearing have been absorbed back into the woodland, with little visible evidence remaining of the tragedy that unfolded there more than a century ago. Occasional hikers and hunters pass through the area, most unaware of its dark history. Modern investigators and historians who have studied the case note that it represents a unique combination of factors that made it particularly difficult to resolve completely. The geographic isolation, limited communication methods, primitive investigation techniques, and the perpetrator's apparent intelligence and planning all contributed to the mystery's enduring nature. While the broad outlines of what occurred are clear from the surviving evidence, many specific details about the final weeks of the investigation remain unknown. The psychological profile that emerges of Cornelius Crane from the surviving evidence suggests a man who became dangerously obsessed with philosophical ideas about isolation and consciousness. His apparent ability to rationalize increasingly extreme actions as being part of a legitimate scientific investigation demonstrates the dangerous potential of unchecked intellectual arrogance combined with social isolation. The case serves as a historical reminder of how isolation and lack of accountability can allow aberrant thinking to escalate to tragic extremes. For modern readers, the Crane case offers insights into the vulnerabilities faced by women in isolated rural communities during the early 20th century, as well as the challenges faced by primitive law enforcement systems in investigating complex psychological crimes. The systematic nature of the psychological manipulation, combined with the perpetrator's ability to maintain his victim's cooperation through reality distortion, presents disturbing parallels to cases of psychological manipulation and control that continue to occur in various forms today. The enduring mystery of what specifically happened to Lydia Crane during her final days and what became of both her and her husband in the end ensures that the case continues to generate interest among those fascinated by unsolved historical crimes. While the essential facts of the case are well established through the surviving evidence, The human element of her experience and ultimate fate remains largely unknowable, adding a tragic dimension to what was already a deeply disturbing chapter in Tennessee criminal history. The winter silence of the Cumberland Plateau holds many secrets, but few as dark as those that unfolded in that isolated homestead during the closing days of 1900 and the opening months of 1901. In the end, both perpetrator and victim vanished into the vastness of the American frontier, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and enduring questions about the nature of isolation, the fragility of human consciousness, and the dangerous potential of minds left unchecked by social contact and reality. The case reminds us that some of the greatest dangers faced by human beings come not from external threats or natural disasters, but from the capacity of the human mind to lose its connection to shared reality and descend into private worlds of delusion and control. In an age when isolation and disconnection from community remain significant social problems, the story of Lydia Crane serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining human connections and the devastating consequences that can result when those connections are deliberately severed.